So, I want to start the conversation with, because it's about gender.
Sure.
And about neo-masculinity, which is this fascist movement that I think arose mostly online and had a big impact, or at least seemed to have an impact on the 2016 American election. Mm-hmm. But it also is rising up in the context of what I think of as sexual confusion, and it's different than it has. I mean, we've been dealing with women's liberation, and we've been dealing with feminist movements for a long time, and so it's not like we're just emerging from a traditional set of norms, but nonetheless, it does seem different today. Maybe it's because of social media. I saw a post about Keanu Reeves and his girlfriend. I don't remember.
Our great national Canadian treasure, Keanu
yes,
Reeves.
Yeah, Keanu Reeves,
gifted actor.
the really tremendous actor. So, but actually, I kind of like Keanu Reeves, and he's become something of an internet meme.
Yeah.
He's supposed to be, decent. What he's most famous for now, I guess, is not being a shit.
Yeah.
And so he's not a shit because he has a girlfriend who's not his age, but not 25. She's like 46, and he's 55, and she has gray hair, and everyone's applauding him for this. And then there's comments on whether or not people should applaud him for this. But the whole thing just seemed distasteful and a little odd to me. Like, it's none of our business. It shouldn't be in my business who celebrities, I mean, obviously celebrity culture is what it is, but it just seemed odd to make it a political thing. So I'm wondering, what do you think that's symptomatic of? And am I right to be put off by that, or?
I actually want to start with a bit of a disclaimer.
Okay.
Which is that for a range of reasons, I mean, I wrote this essay on a subject that interested me, but I don't consider myself to have the authority to speak for feminism or something.
Right.
I have some relation to these kind of texts, but I'm not so deeply steeped in the tradition or activism, that I could purport to speak for that.
Right.
So the answers I give in that respect are merely representative of my own views.
Yeah.
But that having been said, I think there are two things that are interesting about that. And the first one is maybe sort of methodological and maybe a bit slight. But, I think that, in my essay, right, I say that, I think it's very, very important for us to think the politics of sexuality, in a way that, indexes to the domain of the economic, right, which is something, the importance of the domain of the economic is something we stress a lot at Zer0 Books. I think, when you, even setting aside the economic domain, I think when you begin to try to think, sexuality in a political way, right, it's very natural to look around and, of course, to notice that, a lot of the way that our social institutions or even individual choices function, right, are not merely subjective decisions.
Right.
That they reflect kind of overarching structures of power. Of course, I think maybe it's kind of a trivial example, but it's like a well-known, sort of cliche that in Hollywood, men who are successful, maybe not just in Hollywood, right, will often date women who are like 20 years younger.
Right.
30 years younger.
That's the whole reason Keanu Reeves is being praised.
Yeah.
Is because he's not doing that.
But what I want to say about that, the first thing I want to say, again, which is just sort of methodological, is that, when we think these things politically, I think that when we try to, right, because I'm going to continue on and explain how I don't necessarily think this is the best articulation of it, but insofar as we're trying to think it politically, I think that we have to understand that there's also a limitation of the capacity of these sort of generalizations or even statistical data to apprehend all the particular aspects of someone's personal situation.
Right.
To generalize about a sort of social institution and how it functions, or social power structures, that is absolutely fair. It's fair to politicize it. Right. But to do so, you have to understand that you're doing so at a general level.
Right.
And so I think that one also has to practice, a certain degree of humility, in terms of how they make these interventions into people's personal lives. I know actually, I'm thinking of sort of an interesting example of this because what was it when Jon Stewart left The Daily Show?
Yeah.
Right, I understand, and he was replaced by Trevor Noah eventually, but
I think right away. I don't think anyone was.
Yeah, okay, but there was another woman on there. I think there was a woman there. I forget her name.
Oh, there was she?
I'm a terrible chauvinist. I forget her name. I think, and I could be wrong about this, but I think she was like, what I guess you described it, as a woman of color in these sort of circles. And people, she said, "Well, I'm not interested in taking over. It's kind of too much for me. I don't want to do it." And then I think someone wrote an article, right, about how her response was symptomatic of the tendency of women, and particularly women of color, to kind of undervalue their own accomplishments and not reach out for these kind of higher level opportunities.
Right.
And her response was basically like, back the fuck out of my personal life.
Right.
Like how do you just take this structure,
right,
and apply it to me personally? So again, I think politicization is absolutely important.
But okay, what I point out there in that particular example is that isn't a structure. That what that is a symptom of a structure. Women of color tend to not do this.
Yeah.
That's not the structural reason why. Right. And when you ask the question, or when you look at the relationships between men and women, and older men who are successful and younger women, the fact that this tends to happen a lot is a symptom of something, but we don't know what it's a symptom of yet.
With respect to this, I feel that often what happens is that because we don't fundamentally link these sort of pervasive social behaviors to economic factors, what happens is there's just this kind of very contingent moralizing that kind of crops up, in lieu of a more thorough response.
Right.
And so I think with something like this, it's very much just a kind of a knee-jerk response to the situation. And I think the whole kind of valorization of Keanu Reeves is representing some alternative to the masculine depravity of Me Too itself is like very much.
I feel like Keanu is being set up for a big fall.
It's a risk too, right?
Right.
But I think another good example actually in this vein is, and this is sort of how I feel about the notion of cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the discourse, it tends to polarize in a certain way, where you're either on one side, and I think this is really funny when people say this, they're like, all cultural history is appropriation. It's like, well, okay, like that is a generalization. Good work,
Right.
I think there really are instances of this that are important to address. But I also think that the basic problem with the way people go about it is that it doesn't index at all to a sense of the underlying economic effects that are actually enacted because of this, right? So it becomes a very arbitrary, kind of moralistic thing, and it's like, well, you have cornrows, you're appropriating black culture. It's like, in those, the fact that you have a group like, to give a historic example, and there are plenty of things like this that happen today, but the fact that you have a group like the Beach Boys that were able to step into the scene, with a song like Surfing USA,
which is just a straight. What is that the one that's just a rip-off of Chuck Berry?
Sweet Little 16. It's
the
exact same song.
Yeah,
with great harmonies.
Right.
But it's a great cover.
They had to pay him though. They did have to pay him.
Later, right? There was a suit.
Yeah.
But what I mean is that I think insofar as those kind of things happen, you can see that there's the real economic opportunities that are being deprived.
Right.
Or the people are.
Thanks for the boomer reference. It helps me.
That's obviously like quite a basic and I think superficial example.
Yeah.
But I think that again, when we look at context of cultural appropriation, I think it's very, very important to say, well, is this just some sort of abstract stylistic gesture that's being borrowed? Because if that is what it is, then I would immediately subscribe to the response that cultural transmission is part of history and that sort of generalization.
Right.
But if we're talking about things that really are imposing economic damages, right, upon certain groups.
Right. Well, in the case you bring up, it's a serious thing, and obviously, if you just look at the birth of rock and roll, there was definitely a moment, a long period of time where white musicians were able to really appropriate gigs and contracts and careers that ought to have been going to black musicians, or at least as well. You know, they should have been probably at the forefront and certainly included, because these were acts and songs and a whole style that the white musicians were coming in. But not, I don't think that the aim was to oppress these people. There was real camaraderie amongst the all of rock.
Arthur Crudup said, like, you know, like people who accuse Elvis of ripping off black music, they don't see the checks I get for the song.
Right.
And by the way, I'm not endorsing uncritically that perspective.
Right.
But I think it's very
well.
important.
No, it was true, but it's also. I mean, on the other hand, rock music brought people together across racial lines.
Yeah.
And
it did
there was
coincide with civil rights.
And I think that there's an American culture, which is both black and white. Largely, not you know, to some degree because of things like rock music that we in America share across ethnic lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more serious issue there is, now I'm probably gonna misquote here,
right?
But I want to say, and this may not have happened, right? But you know, fuck it, okay, it works for the purposes of this example. I want to say I think there was like an exchange with Kanye West, and he complained that the Grammy Awards were racist.
Right.
And then they said, well, how can you say that the Grammy Awards are racist when in fact there's a large number, and they cited some percentage, like, you know, I don't know what it was, right?
Like 30%.
Something, yeah, like above the black proportion of people.
Right, but not above the black proportion of musicians.
Sure, but like whatever, right? Like, and I think his response was basically to the effect of, you know, if this were objectively representative of people's talent, 90% of them would be black, you know. And that's also, you know, this is also interesting too, right? Because it's like, you know, some kind of simplistic criteria of affirmative action isn't necessarily, you know, the solution either. Right. Because we do see that there are certain groups that are more involved with producing certain things. But
if it wasn't Kanye, I might take it more seriously. But I mean, the guy almost stepped on Beck. You know how important Beck is to Gen Xers.
Yeah. Oh, wait, of course. I see. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to go back and say something about what you did at the very start.
Okay.
Where you said, I just want to make a disclaimer, I can't speak to this. But it seems to me that when we're talking about gender and sex relations, you don't have to be a woman to speak with some authority on it, because you're talking about something that is two-sided. You're not talking about it necessarily from only the perspective of a woman or a feminist. You can be talking about it from the perspective of someone who's looking at the totality of it and giving their best effort. Now, you maybe were saying, well, I just don't know the topic as well as some other people would know it. And not saying, I'm not a woman, therefore I can't speak to this. Yeah. But were you in any sense saying, I'm not a woman, therefore I can't speak to this?
Well, you know, I think that, like, rather than necessarily discussing hypotheticals, I think probably there's a relationship between those two things. Right. Right? That I'm not as steeped in it. Right. You know, as I would, you know, and whatever. Like, I've read Mary Wollstonecraft and I've read Judith Butler. Right. You know, but
you are steeped in a Marxist approach to feminist or issues around gender, or at least, you know, you've read it.
I think what attracted me to writing the piece, you know, was not so much to position myself as a spokesperson of feminism, but to enact an auto-critique of some of the perhaps deleterious trends in terms of the positioning of masculinity itself. Mm-hmm. And I think it was on that basis that I felt that, you know, perhaps I had the authority to intervene. Yeah.
It seems to me that concerns about modern gender relations, while not often expressed in these ways, are born out of the way capitalist society dissolves social structures. New forms of relating become necessary as the technical and social structures around production change primarily. For instance, monogamy may no longer be the aim of romantic relationships. Yeah. And this is something you talk about in your essay. If this is so, then the question arises, at what should men and women aim? And in your essay you wrote that it's clear that adherence to strategies devised by pickup artists is hardly a pathway to a healthy relationship with the opposite sex. What I immediately thought is, what constitutes a healthy relationship in this context? It seems to me that if we no longer have a monogamy as an aim, or any clear aim, it's very hard to have moral objections to men who aim to just pick up women and have a lot of sexual encounters. At least it's not. we would need to develop a basis on which to make a critique of that.
Sure.
So I want to leave it there. It's like, I mean, I'm not trying to defend bad behavior or impolite behavior or denigrating behavior, but the fact that there are men who just would prefer or seemingly want to have a lot of different relationships with women without any commitment, and who prize sexual conquest, that's not something that's really easy to critique if we don't have any clear understanding of what the aim of our romantic relations should be today. So what do you think it should be, or how do we start to develop a new basis or new understanding of these kinds of relations?
I want to say that I don't think that what bothers me about that culture is the fact that people are interested in sleeping with other partners.
Right.
I don't think that's the problem.
Right.
I think, nor do I think that, in a context in which there's, in a context in which, let's not, obviously sexual desire is not restricted to men, in a context in which there, is this reciprocity you can see in clubs and going out venues and things like that.
Right.
Nor do I think that it's necessarily, malevolent, right, for someone to ask the question to themselves of, well, how can I be more successful?
Right.
In this way, right? Insofar as that's what you want, that is what you want to do. I'm not sure if that's a good thing to do for your life, but if you want to do it.
Right.
But I think this is very interesting, because I think what is really, and what had been latent for a long time, what's bothersome about pickup cultures is the way that I mentioned before, that there's this idea that you sort of hack women's brains.
Right.
It's and you see these kind of threads like on these forums, right? They'll be like, do women like this, or something?
Right.
Fuck you talking about?
Right.
I think it's this strong tendency, and you see it within the narrative of hypergamy that I discussed.
Yeah.
This very strong tendency to actually treat human agency as not fully developed.
Yeah.
Right, and clearly that represents a kind of reification of traditional patriarchal structures that are persistent.
Right.
Within capitalism, and a biologization of them. And actually, but I pointed in the essay that I think there was a big contradiction, because I think that the reality is that pickup artist culture only developed because of feminism, right? In terms of there being this domain where you could say, well, let's try to sort of, on some level, let's try to appeal to female desire, right? Let's try to transform ourselves into these.
Right. I wouldn't say that it's feminism per se. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wouldn't say it's feminism is responsible per se, but the same conditions that bring rise to feminist demands also bring this around. It's not so much that, women are more empowered, therefore men have to work harder to seduce them, but also the traditional aims of relationships are dissolving, and that gives women the space to get out from under what are sometimes oppressive relations and enter the world as their own people, into the public sphere more over the last, 100 years. But it also means that for men, their aims are no longer directed towards that traditional male role either.
Yeah. And
so it's not so much that they are trying to, I don't think feminism as a demand or feminist struggle is responsible, but the totality of this system that's creating good effects and bad effects.
Well, just very basically in the sense that, there has to be a sufficient level of economic autonomy to permit the free expression of sexual desire before you start thinking about, how are we going to appeal to that desire?
Right, I guess that's true.
And of course there are all kinds of aggressive overtures.
The 70s was the very big moment for feminism, and the big changes seemed to happen then. And it's as soon as that starts to happen that you start having also this reaction against it. But it seems like we're not solving the problem, even as both people become a little bit more independent in the realm of the labor market. But the problem still sort of remains that we're not having truly equal relations or free relations. And the other thing I'd want to point out is it's not as though in 1950s America, a woman's desire had no impact on who she ended up with. We're not looking at a society where it came out of arranged marriages or something. So
Well, I mean, you know, modern feminism is related to the role women played in the industrial workforce. I think it's safe to say that.
yeah, I think so too.
And that's the point Engels makes in the
Right.
Origin of Family, Private Property,
Right.
and the State. Yeah.
When I was reading over your essay, I started looking around online, as I do, at some of the source material, and I ended up reading some Hal Draper.
Okay.
So the thing about reading Hal Draper was that he thinks that essentially Marx's and Engels' understanding of family and the necessity for there to be a structure mediating women and men's relationships, and relationships, long-term romantic or sexual relationships between any set of genders, the need for that may not be fully, that may not only be economic. I mean that it may not be that the bourgeois family or the bourgeois set of relations destroyed the family, or
You know, I'm just very skeptical about any kind of romanticization of monogamy, you know, or this sort of very tenuous conflation of it with kind of the emergence from the void that Zizek has, or kind of the Badian event, right? You know, again, I'm interested in understanding things economically and historically. And I think that, you know, well, I'm gonna answer your question in two parts.
yeah,
Right. I think first of all, to use a word like monogamy. Okay, so in the Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, which derives heavily from Morgan's researches in ancient society.
yeah,
And this stuff has become somewhat fashionable just recently again, right? From I think just the mid 2000s with the work being done at the University of Utah by Helen Alvarez. But for a long time that was just dismissed. I mean, even Levi Strauss, you know, is very critical of the thesis of primitive matrilineality.
right,
Or matrilocality, as the fancy anthropologists say
Right.
these days. You know, what is stressed by Engels qua Morgan in that account is that, you know, you always to have one pairing is actually it's always seemingly always existing in humans, right? That is always there, right? But that the institution of monogamy, right? You know, this which really is about the control of women's sexuality, not men's, right? Is imposed at a specific point in time, right? And it has to do with the seizure of agricultural surpluses by men, right? You know, and the shift to patrilineality, through,
Yeah.
You know, passing down wealth through the male lines,
right,
and then simply the fact that, you know, if you're in an environment where you're tracing lineage through the female side, you know, it's who has the child, right? But to make sure, right, that the patriarchal heir, you know who it is.
Well, yeah.
Right, then you're controlling women's sexuality. And Engels points out that you know, monogamy was never monogamy for men. I mean, in every society where there's been monogamy, there's been a class of usually, or invariably, lower class women, right, who served as a prostitute class, right? And you see this even today, right? You know, you look at a society like Egypt, right, that's very sort of familial monogamian, right? You know, and there's a huge social problem of prostitution, right? You see that class that exists to serve that. Yeah.
So was there monogamy when there was? You're saying that there was not monogamy when it was a more matriarchal or matrilineal line. When you were tracing offspring through the women to the mothers, monogamy wasn't part of the equation.
No.
Men and women were both sleep around.
Well, yeah, and my understanding, and I think you're going to find that it varies a great deal throughout societies. We're generalizing a great deal,
Yeah, right.
like most of human history, you know.
But why is it so difficult? Is it just that human beings aren't meant to be monogamous, or that's just a
Well, I didn't say
natural
that. What I
state?
said is that it was very common for people for you to have partnerships of one person and one person.
Right.
Right. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be, you know, that it's institutionalized socially the same way, or rule bound, or that it revolves so much around the principle of controlling women's sexuality, or there's you know.
Well, because
all of these
when you say it that
economic
way, it almost sounds like when it was matrilineal, then there was monogamy, but it wasn't enforced from above. It wasn't politically maintained. That was a kind of that one-on-one pairing is just a fact that happens. Whereas now, in a patriarchal society where things are more political and private property dominates and so on and so forth, now monogamy has to be enforced, and it isn't enforced in a two-sided way. It's only enforced for women for the most part. I mean, that's not so much the case now, literally now, but because, you know, women have more economic power than ever, and at least not than ever, but then they have for a long time.
Sure.
But okay, so just to clarify, the difficulty is not so much that the hypocrisy of monogamy, but the suppression of women in order to maintain it.
So if we understand that this is the background, right? This sort of economic control that's imposed, I think that what we really need to do. I mean, I think that you're talking about how it still seems to be necessary for a society, right, to have something like an institution of monogamy.
It seems to me that we need to have some set of norms around our romantic relationships that are not just based on individualistic desires. That we need to structure those desires. Not that we should try to suppress people's desires, but as they are right now, it seems as though we are in a state of contradictions. On the one hand, I think we're really in a mess, because on the one hand, women's desire is privileged. On the other hand, it's also denied. Sure. And in fact, in order for it to be privileged, it has to be denied. Those two things seem to me to consistently come together. Like, women's sexual desire is a great, wonderful thing because it has been suppressed or is not conceived to be dangerous, in the way that men's sexual desires are conceived to be dangerous. But if we were to just grant women the same kind of desire that we grant men, then we would see it as dangerous. I think, because I think sex is dangerous. And so that's one side of it. The other side of it is that, obviously I don't think that, my feeling is that it's very difficult to separate love from sex, and that's a natural kind of consequence of the kind of creatures we are, and that when we have sex, doesn't mean we have to get married, but it should be a serious act. It shouldn't be considered the same as, God, I'm such a boomer. It should be, people should take each other seriously, because it's a serious thing to do, and and I'm being a romantic. This is maybe my romantic side, but I feel as though we are very conflicted about. We don't have a way to take things seriously other than these traditional forms, but we need to develop them, because the traditional forms are oppressive. But on the other hand, the total openness that's promised by maybe a consumer culture or culture of capitalism is false and kind of dehumanizing.
I think that I don't disagree with you about there being certain benefits provisionally that are associated with that. But I just want to say that I think we should be very careful about appealing to social reality in that way, right? Very often, complying with kind of social directives that are dominant, does work because society's structured in that way, right? But I think that this that can almost have a bit of a whiff of kind of postmodern conservatism about it if you go too far in that endorsement, which I'm not saying you're doing, right? And this is kind of the action this is kind of what often you see sort of neo-masculinists pursue, right? So they'll cite a study. I think there's a study that couples where men and women have less traditional roles, like men are homemakers and women work, are more eligible to end in divorce.
Yeah.
Right? And they'll cite a study like that, and they'll be like, well, this is proof that we need to have these kind of traditional things.
Yeah, well, that's hogwash, obviously.
When you were talking about the role of the family, I mean, it seems to me that if you, if the left, say, is complicit with the movement of capital in terms of encouraging just sort of the dissolution of these traditional institutions. So let's say sort of the synthesis of neoliberalism in the spirit of '68, something like bad deal we often talk about. This can engender a great deal of alienation, right? If there aren't alternative institutions for people to go to, right? Because we have certain institutions that are.
So you're agreeing with me again?
I am agreeing with you. Yeah. So what I want to say about that is like, so it seems to me, for example, that and I think the whole kind of a lot of the success of the religious right in the United States can owe to an incapacity to construct alternative social institutions to the monogamy family and to the church, within new suburban environments within the Sun Belt, essentially.
Right.
But it's interesting in England though, for example, right? Because I was saying that I think England provides an interesting counterpoint to the development of feminism in France.
Yeah.
Because I was saying, you didn't have as thorough neoliberalization in France. And so there was a lot more money that was provided, right? Also, I think owing to some kind of nativist sentiment, to support families and to keep the birth rate high. It's been consistently higher here than other parts of Europe.
Right.
Comparable to Ireland, where up till recently abortion was illegal, right? So there's a lot of support here. Yeah. But one thing is that I think that had the paradoxical consequence of preserving certain patriarchal social traditions. Even as it did provide women with more support economically, right? So there's a good and a bad. By contrast, I think if you look in England, right, I think that you had a certain social good that was affected paradoxically in this kind of accelerationist way by just like tossing a bunch of women in the labor market, which is basically what happened. But the thing is that I don't think it was, I don't think that it necessarily channeled itself in a way that was congenial to the development of the left, right? Because the social institutions didn't exist, right? To kind of accommodate those people, and unions obviously are a great example of these functions historically, but to kind of accommodate those people, and to support their struggles, and to kind of channel that in a direction, right? And so I think that, in that context, it's unsurprising that you get, I think one of the Spice Girls in the 90s said that Thatcher was a great example of girl power, and more recently they invited Theresa May, under the Spice Girls invited Theresa May to the reunion concert.
Oh my God.